On this Thursday edition of Locked On Grizzlies, we check in on where Memphis is in the Western Conference standings. We talk about yearning for Grizzlies ghosts of the past, and we also pump the brakes on some trade speculation, at least for the time being. This is Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. It is I, Joe Mullinax, contributor over at Bale Street Bears, a contributor over at Grizzly Bear Blues on Substack, and a contributor, of course, as a co-host to Locked On Grizzlies, and I am the host for this particular edition of the program. No to Michael Cole, Memphis Grizzlies beat writer for the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis. It is I, flying solo with you. Hopefully you'll stick around and talk Memphis Grizzlies basketball with me for the next 30 minutes or so here on Locked On Grizzlies. Today's episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. We're free and available wherever you get podcasts as proud members of the #1 sports podcast network out there, the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, Google, YouTube, wherever it is that you get podcasts. Make DeMichael and myself part of your NBA and Memphis Grizzlies content consumption. Each and every time that an episode drops, become an everydayer if you are not already one. This feels like a good time, as good a time as any, with this extended break for the Memphis Grizzlies going into tomorrow's game. It's nice to be able to say that. Tomorrow's game with the Utah Jazz, the likely return of Ja Morant, as we covered in our last episode of the show, feels like a good chance to kind of get the lay of the land in the Western Conference. And out west, as with the NBA at large, it starts with the Oklahoma City Thunder, the class of the National Basketball Association, the very best team in the entire league by a pretty sizable margin. The defending champions running away with the Western Conference, already 5.5 games, about 6 games as of this recording, ahead of their next closest competitor. They absolutely dominate the Phoenix Suns on Wednesday night. A really impressive performance sending them out to Las Vegas for the NBA Cup. It's hard to see anybody getting in the way of OKC unless a team like the Knicks wins the Giannis Antetokounmpo sweepstakes, makes a major trade, and then maybe New York can pick them off in the finals. But out west, it's getting really hard to see anybody upsetting the Oklahoma City Thunder, the Los Angeles Lakers, Denver Nuggets, Houston Rockets. The Spurs are an upstart team, but nobody really has the firepower, the talent, the tenacity, the coaching. OKC just seems really well primed and set up to be a thorn in the side of the entire league, not just the Western Conference, for the foreseeable future. So OKC, until they are beaten, they are the class of the process. Then I mentioned a moment ago, the Lakers, the Nuggets, the Rockets. They probably make up that next tier of contending teams. And the reason I have them in front of a team like the San Antonio Spurs or a team like the Minnesota Timberwolves that have made the Western Conference Finals the last couple of years, I would even probably put the Timberwolves in front of the Spurs regardless of record, is the star power that those teams provide. Obviously, the Los Angeles Lakers have Luka Doncic. They have Austin Reeves. They have LeBron James. That's pretty impressive. The Denver Nuggets, led by Nikola Jokic, who is somehow having a better season this season than he has had in prior MVP campaigns. And then, of course, the Houston Rockets playing really well. Kevin Durant now in the fold. I would put all three of those teams in front of the Spurs and then even Anthony Edwards in the Minnesota Timberwolves. The Spurs with Victor Wembanyama, the Spurs when healthy with Stephon Castle back in the fold, they are very much deserving of being that sixth team in that playoff hunt. I feel like there is a really set kind of structure there with the top 6 teams in the Western Conference. You've got OKC, and then it's everybody else, with that everybody else being more Nuggets and Lakers and Rockets. Probably not in that order. I'd probably go Nuggets, Rockets, Lakers, and then the Timberwolves, and then the Spurs. That would be how I would have them ranked. But again, in terms of standings, it's a little bit inverted at 5 and 6, with San Antonio being in front of Minnesota for the time being. Then you've got the play-in mix. And the Grizzlies are pretty firmly in the play-in mix at this stage. They're pretty firmly outside of the playoff mix. But they are the 9 seed as of this recording, and they are probably going to be in that conversation for the remainder of the season. And the reason that I am confident in saying that, even on the eve of Ja Morant's return, even with all of the cynicism that I have had regarding Tuomas Isalo, the rotation choices, how the team is interacting and beating bad teams and not beating good teams, even with all of that, I can confidently say to you, dear listener, dear viewer, that I envision the Grizzlies finishing no worse than 9th in the Western Conference. And here is why. The Phoenix Suns, who got obliterated by the Oklahoma City Thunder on Wednesday night, they don't seem to be going away anytime soon. And we'll talk about Dillon Brooks and overachieving former Grizzlies players later on in the show. But I do think that Phoenix deserves credit for being where they are. I see them cooling, but I don't see them completely falling out of favor. I think the same is true of the Golden State Warriors, considering they're actively trying to be good. The Golden State Warriors are a sneaky sleeper pick for Giannis in terms of him winding up alongside Steph Curry out there in California. If that happens, all bets are off, and the Warriors should be considered in that Lakers, Nuggets, and Rockets tier. Maybe they're not quite good enough to beat the Thunder, but certainly good enough to make the Western Conference Finals and try to give OKC a run for their money the next year or two ahead of Steph Curry's eventual retirement, right? The Warriors aren't going anywhere, more than likely. That brings you to the Grizzlies, and the Grizzlies have a chance coming out of the end of this weekend to be a 500 basketball team, which would be a huge thing for them considering all that Memphis has gone through so far this season. Look beyond what the Grizzlies, who are actively trying to compete. The Portland Trail Blazers have a lot of stuff going on their front as well, and they are not necessarily in the same space as Memphis actively trying to compete. The Portland Trail Blazers want to win, but they are not expecting to be in that playoff play-in mix the same way that a Grizzlies or a Warriors team might be. The Dallas Mavericks, there's rumors swirling around them involving Anthony Davis. Is he going to be in the mix long-term for them? A trade to the Atlanta Hawks, a trade to Detroit Pistons. Ideas are being floated. Probably not the best look for a team that is actively considering making a push for the play-in. Dallas may not be longed for that play-in life. And then the Utah Jazz, the Grizzlies' opponent, coming up on Friday. The Jazz were a surprise start to the season squad. They have tailed off. This is more so the Utah Jazz team that was expected. The Jazz have lost 7 of their last 10 contests. They are not actively trying to compete. They were kind of viewed as the one tanking team in the entire National Basketball Association, at least for a short time in preseason. So then you have the Kings, then you have the Clippers, then you have the Pelicans. The Clippers are the wild card, right? They're currently 5 or so games behind the Grizzlies in the play-in standings, but the Clippers are, in theory, trying to be a good basketball team. Maybe they try to rattle off some victories as the season goes on. Maybe they make a trade not Giannis-sized, but they try to do something to compete a little bit. They could replace the Portland Trail Blazers, right? I could see Portland tumbling out of 10 and a team like the Clippers climbing up into that spot. I don't see the Grizzlies falling much further than where they currently are. And that is both good and bad, right? That is both a pro and a con. Because on the positive side, you can be excited about the fact that this team, which has retooled in the wake of the Desmond Bane trade, and we'll talk more about Des here in a moment as well, a team that is retooled after that transaction is competing in a similar fashion. Not exactly the same, but in terms of wins and losses, they have not fallen off so dramatically as it appeared they may do earlier in the campaign, and they are better set up for the future. That is reason for optimism regarding the Memphis Grizzlies. However, con, the way that that success has happened has not gone the way that you as a Memphis Grizzlies fan, me as a Memphis Grizzlies content creator, anybody that follows the franchise, nobody had Zach Edey being called the most significant member of the organization moving forward on their bingo card. Unless you're a crazy person on social media, in which case, kudos to you, you got this one right. As of now, that is technically true. Let's see what happens over the next few games with Ja returning. Let's see if Jaren's able to snap out of his funk. But the way that this has transpired is not necessarily conducive to the Grizzlies being a legitimate threat. You could easily argue the Grizzlies were not a legitimate threat before the Desmond Bane trade, and that's one of the reasons the Bane trade went down. And to that, I would say touche. But the reality of the situation is this. Memphis has put themselves in a better spot to have a lane that's a little bit wider to contention down the road, and they are still competing in a way comparable to what they'd had before the Desmond Bane trade. No matter how well Bane is doing for the Magic, or any other player is doing for any other team for that matter, the Grizzlies look to be in a position of not necessarily power, but a position of consistency, at least checking out the standings as of today. Let me know in the comments. Hit me up on X at Joe Mullinax. How are you feeling about the Grizzlies as of this moment? Again, the Thunder are the Thunder. Where do you see them kind of falling as the season marches forth, as the NBA Cup quarters become semis and the season resumes for Memphis tomorrow? We come back here on Locked On Grizzlies. We are going to talk about Desmond Bane and Dillon Brooks and the successes of Grizzlies past. Stick around here on Locked On Grizzlies. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Game Time. The World Cup is coming back to North America for the first time since 1994, and with 48 teams for the first time ever, it is going to be massive. But let's be honest, getting tickets is usually the hardest part. That's why the Game Time app is clutch, finally giving fans a real advantage when it comes to snagging seats. With Game Time, you can track price drops in real time, get alerts when great seats open, and buy tickets the moment they hit the app. It puts the power back in your hands and makes going to the World Cup realistic instead of impossible. You can pull up the app, and the layout makes it so simple to scroll through matchups and compare seat views, and those seat view features are game changers. You literally see what the pitch looks like from your exact seat before you buy. Take the guesswork out of buying World Cup tickets in every match, concert, or event with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, download the app, make an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Swipe, tap, ticket, go. Game Time. Today's episode of Locked On Grizzlies also brought to you by Quo. New year, new systems. And this is the time when a lot of us look at the messier parts of running a business and think there has to be a better way, and there is. Today's episode, again, brought to you by Quo, spelled Quo, the smarter way to run your business communications. If you're ready to make your workday smoother and keep customers connected without the headaches, Quo makes upgrading your setup easier than ever. Having calls, texts, and voicemails in one clean view keeps everything organized and helps you stay responsive. Being able to share one team number makes it so much easier to make sure nothing gets missed. Make this the year where no opportunity and no customer slips away. Try Quo for free, plus get 20% off your first 6 months when you go to quo.com/LockedOnNBA. That's QUO.com/LockedOnNBA. Quo, no missed calls, no missed customers. So as the Freudian slip, as the NBA Cup, right, my favorite basketball event, as that has played out over the last couple of days, varying degrees of yearning for Grizzlies past have occurred, right? And we see it a lot with the Steven Adamses of the world. And I've acknowledged that Steven Adams was underappreciated in Memphis, and this offensive rebounding revolution that folks have written about and talked about on social media. Steven Adams has been living that life for a long time, right? But in the NBA Cup, you see in particular players like Dillon Brooks doing really strong things for the Phoenix Suns. Not necessarily against the Oklahoma City Thunder, but in the overall scope of the tournament and the season so far. Dillon looks to be the best version of himself out in Phoenix right now. Desmond Bane is finding his footing with the Orlando Magic. And Orlando's got some injury concerns and issues, and yet they are still going to Vegas as part of that NBA Cup tournament because, in part, of the play of a star-level contributor, Desmond Bane. And that is naturally going to lead to questions from Grizzlies fans, people that follow the team. I get asked almost every day, do you regret moving on from a player like a Desmond Bane? Do you regret seeing Dillon Brooks having success elsewhere, given what he was in Memphis? And in the interest of full disclosure, what both Bane and Brooks wanted to be in Memphis, right? Those guys loved Memphis. Dillon Brooks saw himself as a cornerstone piece of the Memphis Grizzlies. Desmond Bane, for a short time, was a cornerstone piece of the Memphis Grizzlies. And then the calculus changed for the organization coming out of the end of last season. Obviously, Dillon was moved on from before that. But should we miss Dillon Brooks and Desmond Bane? I think that you can miss the kind of personality they were. I think that you can miss the level of leadership that players like Dillon Brooks and Desmond Bane provided. They were two very different models of leadership, right? Dillon Brooks was fearless, a legitimately audacious player like Ja Morant used to be. Dillon Brooks went out and actively was the aggressor. He was the villain. He embraced it. Desmond Bane has kind of taken on some of that energy, right? Whether it's chucking balls at opponents or, mentioning it and wanting to compete in the NBA Cup and win in joking fashion because you got fined for what you did against the Knicks, throwing the ball. That is what the Grizzlies of a few years ago maybe would have participated and partaken in. Do I miss that mentality? I miss this team having fun on a night in, night out basis. We haven't seen that freedom of play in a long time. But I do think we take for granted context, and that's human nature. Dillon Brooks was never going to be, for the Memphis Grizzlies, what he currently is out with the Phoenix Suns, because of the fact, and this is true, that Dillon Brooks saw himself as something more with the Memphis Grizzlies than the Memphis Grizzlies saw him as. And that's not Dillon Brooks' fault. Dillon was asked from the time that he was selected as a second-round pick to be far more than he ever should have been asked to be. So should we be surprised that Dillon Brooks saw himself as a Jaren Jackson Jr. level contributor or a Ja Morant contributor in a Memphis Grizzlies uniform? No. We shouldn't be surprised. And if you watch Dillon Brooks play like I did, and I'm guessing you, wonderful everydayer, you've probably watched Dillon Brooks as a Memphis Grizzly in the past, whether it's highlights or actually living it live. Dillon Brooks was not that level of talent, but he had that level of mentality. He was always going to have to move on somewhere else for the true productivity of what Dillon can be, for it to be unlocked. And kudos to Dillon. I'll always have a soft spot in my heart for Dillon Brooks. I think he can play in this league, and he's showing that with the Phoenix Suns, helping them overachieve, much like he helped the Memphis Grizzlies overachieve a few years ago. But we can't pretend like that Dillon in Phoenix was going to be this Dillon in Memphis. The context doesn't suggest that. The precedent and the history of Dillon Brooks as a member of the organization doesn't suggest that. Desmond Bane, we have a little bit more evidence that he could put up these kinds of numbers if he were still in Memphis. But we have a different kind of precedent in history with Dez. Those numbers did not lead to winning at the level that the Grizzlies are hoping to win at. And the reality of the situation in this new CBA era is paying that much money and having that much inflexibility in terms of team building to have Ja Morant, Jaren Jackson Jr., and Desmond Bane as your three best players. That was not going to be sustainable for a team that is actively trying to win. It just wasn't. And that doesn't mean that Bane should have been the one that was traded. We can have that conversation. I think that that was the easiest guy to trade. And I think you could argue from a basketball standpoint, I'm sure Grizzlies GM Zach Kleiman would and has, whether it's Jalen Wells being a replacement, the most ready-made replacement on the roster, whether it is the box office draw that is Ja Morant, and we'll talk more about that, of course, not just today, but moving forward here on Locked On Grizzlies. That matters in Memphis, Tennessee. It matters everywhere, but especially in Memphis. And Jaren Jackson Jr., let's not act like he wasn't a top 20 player in the NBA last season. He received multiple All-NBA votes. I think he finished 2 spots away from being an All-NBA player. So Jaren's struggles now should not blind what Jaren did last season. So it's easy sitting here now to watch Desmond Bane help get the Orlando Magic to the semifinals of the NBA Cup and say Dez should be in Beale Street Blue and Ja should have been traded or Jaren should have been traded. But you have to be able to hold on to 2 things at the same time. Appreciating what Dez is doing, what Dillon is doing, what other former Grizzlies are doing in their spots, and acknowledging that that level of success, whether it's team success in the case of Dez and not being able to turn those numbers into that level of achievement compared to pay and roster inflexibility that would have sustained if Dez had stayed, or pretending that Dillon Brooks would have been this version of him in Memphis when that wasn't the mentality around which Dillon was a significant part of building the culture that was successful here for some time. You can hold on to both things at the same time. You can wish those guys well and acknowledge that just because they're doing it there doesn't mean that they'd be doing it here. Do you agree with me? Do you support Dez and Dillon and wish them well while acknowledging just because it's happening elsewhere doesn't mean it would happen with the Memphis Grizzlies? Hit me up on X at Joe Mullinax. Let me know in the comments. I don't know if you've heard or not, but we have this wonderful Everydayer Club coming about, okay? And Locked On Grizzlies, hopefully your first lesson every day. Thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. You already live this idea of your team every day. Now take it up a level and go ad-free. Join the Everydayer Club today and get Locked On Grizzlies with no interruptions, members-only Discord access, and more, all for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Go to this URL. Go to lockedongrizzlies.supercast.com today and check out our wonderful, wonderful process that is Locked On Grizzlies through the Everydayer Club. Go and check it out today. Today's episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Zocdoc. Guys, it is 2025, almost 2026, and those days of waiting for something to become a full-blown emergency before you see a doctor, they're over. No more walking it off for 6 months. No more pretending the weird shoulder stiffness is sleeping wrong. It's time to take your health seriously, and Zocdoc makes that easier than ever, because staying healthy is more than just hitting the gym or eating right. It's about actually getting things checked out when something feels off. Using Zocdoc makes scheduling easier. Search for in-network doctors and book right in the app. There's no more back and forth phone calls, waiting weeks to be seen. Real-time appointments are listed, including same-day visits, and it allows for you to compare providers using real patient reviews, not ads. So stop putting off your doctor's appointments and get the care you need. Go to ZocDoc.com/LockedOnNBA to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. That's ZocDoc.com/LockedOnNBA, ZocDoc.com/LockedOnNBA. Go check them out now. Closing out this edition of Locked On Grizzlies with an acknowledgement as the reigning, defending armchair GM champion that I have been getting some interesting trade ideas. I got a wonderful email. Thank you so much to the Brandis Leverett. I am grateful to Brandis for emailing me. Would love to hear these trade ideas discussed on the show involving Minnesota. All right? Whether it's Ja Morant and Brandon Clark being sent out for Dante DiVincenzo, Jaden McDaniels, Naz Reid, Mike Conley, or Ja and Brandon for DiVincenzo, Conley, and Reid, and the first-round pick in a couple of seconds. Ja Morant to the Minnesota Timberwolves. That's a rumor, a speculated landing spot for Ja that gets mentioned pretty often, right? Then you have Bill Simmons, who came out on a podcast recently and said, Jaren Jackson Jr. for Kristaps Porzingis and the 2026 NOLA first-round pick make a lot of sense. And, maybe some other draft capital on top of that. And as attractive as that trade is, and, maybe DeMichael being a part of the actual discussion of the legitimacy of that offer would be a good idea. Because you know me, I can go off the rails a bit when it comes to my trade machine concepts. I want everybody, whether it's Brandis, whether it's Bill Simmons, everybody in between, to pump the brakes. Because I am, as I have been since I started covering this team over a decade ago, Mr. Call Me at Christmas. And we are not quite at Christmas yet, right? Officially 2 weeks away from the holiday. The Grizzlies have several basketball games to play. We've talked about Ja Morant's return being on the horizon, likely coming tomorrow against the Utah Jazz. Let's get as much data as we can on this Memphis Grizzlies team with Zach Edey. Even if you don't believe he's the most significant Grizzly, like I don't believe he's the most significant Grizzly, I think it has to be Ja Morant, or else what's the point? Why is Ja here if he's not the most significant Grizzly? But Zach Edey's super important. Not saying he's not. You need Edey to have success with Ja. Not disputing that. You need to see a reinvigorated, awakened Jaren Jackson Jr., the guy from last year. Hasn't shown up consistently this year. Let's see after these next couple of weeks if we can get into a rhythm with this Grizzlies team that leads to actual wins against teams that are actually good. Let's see if this Grizzlies team can go and compete against the higher level competition and not just beat up on the bottom dwellers. Because if you're asking me, the Grizzlies as presently constructed can go out and compete with the bottom dwellers of the Western Conference and the NBA at large without Jaren Jackson Jr., without Ja Morant. You know how I know that to be true, at least in my opinion, truth in my own mind? Because I've seen it this season. I've watched Jaren Jackson Jr. struggle and the Grizzlies still win against bad teams. I've watched this team have success with Ja Morant not being on the floor. We're talking about ceiling raisers with Ja and Jaren at this stage. They're the ones that make it realistic to try to catch up to the San Antonio Spurs or the Minnesota Timberwolves for the number 6 seed in the playoff conversation. They are the ones who make it possible to envision a world where the Grizzlies get the 7 seed and can knock off a Rockets or a Lakers and can find a way to avoid the Oklahoma City Thunder until the Western Conference Finals. The Jarens and Jaws of the world allow for you to dream those big dreams. If you are comfortable not having those goals, I understand. I think that it's fair to say that, and I think it's fair to talk about being realistic with what to expect from this team moving forward. That's fine. I, in turn, will be much more interested in the weeks to come in trade scenarios involving Ja and Jaren. Because what are we talking about? If you want to reset this thing around Cedric Coward and around Zach Edey, you'd be foolish to not seriously consider a Porzingis for Jaren Jackson Jr. trade if the NOLA first-round pick, which will likely be in the top 5. Have you looked at this draft class? DeMichael and I will talk more about it in the days to come, I'm sure. But the top 5 of this draft, you could get a pretty freaking good basketball player. And that Kristaps Porzingis contract, non-guaranteed, you can get off of that Jaren deal and bring in another young talent. The Minnesota trade? You kidding me? I would go the draft pick route. And you could have a Mike Conley and a DiVincenzo be those guys that kind of get you to the next point guard. And allow for you to remain in that conversation of a play-in team without having a max contract guy on the roster. That's not that crazy to say if you are okay with the play-in is where you're going to be. I'm not ready to say that yet. And I think that we need to see Ja Morant. We need to have Jaren Jackson Jr. alongside Ja. Zach Edey still continuing to find what he's going to be with Morant's return. We need more evidence. And I'm also not ready to take the ceiling of what this team could be and shrink it, bring it back down to size. I'm not ready for that yet. I'm not saying the Grizzlies are competing with the Thunder. I'm not even going to say the Grizzlies are competing with the Rockets or the Lakers or the Nuggets. I am saying Memphis has a better shot against those teams than they do against OKC. And I am saying that you have a better chance to win a series, and as unlikely as it might be, you have a better chance if Ja and Jaren are in the fold. That's just reality, at least as I see it. So I'm not ready for the trades yet, although I do love that people's minds are percolating. Let me know in the comments. Hit me up on X at Joe Mullinax. How are you feeling about trade season approaching? I'm not ready to jump on board just yet, but I know some folks are excited for that part of the process. Thank you so much for being with us on this edition of Locked On Grizzlies. It is much appreciated. Thanks for making us your team every day. And make sure you tune in to tomorrow's show. You know it's Friday. You know we got to get down on a Friday. And you know we'll be previewing Grizzlies Jazz, talking about Ja's return, and so much more. Make sure you're subscribing. Make sure you're following me on X at Joe Mullinax, following DeMichael on X at DeMichaelC. Make sure you're staying on top of all the latest episodes. Locked On Grizzlies, hopefully, was on your Spotify Wrapped. If it was, you should prove it on social media and secure a free month of our brand new Everydayer Club. Just tag our national Locked On Podcast Network account on any social platform and we'll drop you a code. Be one of the first to join the Everydayer Club to get your favorite show ad-free and exclusive access to the members-only Discord channel. And if you're on video, we send you to the first ever 24/7 national NBA YouTube channel. On audio, make sure that you make your second listen NBA game night on Locked On NBA. And again, go to lockedongrizzlies.supercast.com and join our Everydayer Club, taking your fandom to the next level. Make sure you're liking, commenting, rating, reviewing, subscribing on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, Google, YouTube. Make sure you're back with us tomorrow as we get down on another Friday. The Grizzlies are going to be back finally, taking on the Utah Jazz. Ja Morant finally back. Lots to discuss on our next edition of the show. Make sure you're with us. Until then, see ya.